Hi everybody, it's time in this video to reveal the guy I think is most likely to be the historical Jesus and the truth behind it all. The truth as recorded by Josephus and the guy I think was the history behind the myth will be revealed in this video. For the first time in 2,000 years. And this has been under our noses the whole entire time. I want to tell you something now. We only seem to have one primary source on Christ, and this is Josephus. And there might be a couple more which turn up, but Josephus is the comprehensive chronicler of that period, who lived in the period, was ruling class in Judea, knew everything about what was happening, and had all the inside gossip. This helps us to sort fact from fiction. Bear in mind again that none of the biblical sources were primary. In addition, there were actually lots of imitators and Jesuses and Messiahs in the first century. The Messiah had been anticipated for centuries. I think Yahweh, that God, was an Egyptian god by name mixed with a Babylonian god in substance. And meanwhile, we had El worshippers who anticipated for centuries that a figure would rise up and free them from the yoke of the Persians, the Greek rulers, and the Romans. So someone was supposed to come along, assume the mantle of someone like Moses, and then assume rulership of the Jews. I'm just so excited about this. I hope you are too. We're going to talk about this figure. On the balance of probabilities, I think there is no longer any doubt in my mind that this is the guy, this is the one, around which later legends and ideas formed. We are going to take this chronologically, examine what happened, and then in other videos, the imitators who followed and confused everything for us. And then we're going to look at the written tradition which followed after that, because the written tradition is much later after events happened. So then we will be able to see how it all came together chronologically. Now, the Bible was a reconstructed history of this guy from different persons who claimed to have known a Messiah. The problem was there were multiple Messiahs who all did a similar thing. However, Josephus distinguished them for us. Josephus was a brilliant author. He was a Jewish general, very clever, who sucked up to General Vespasian after his capture in the Jewish wars, surrendering after a 6-week siege. He was the leader of Galilee during those wars and before those wars. Galilee, known as Gaulonitis, fought against Rome in the Jewish wars. It joined up with Judea, and just before those wars, in the 50s AD, he was the governor of Galilee. So if he didn't know about Christ, nobody knew about Christ. It is therefore incomprehensible that he did not mention Christ. So I put it to you that therefore he did, and that therefore his writings contain Christ. Now we have to read carefully. We acknowledge the Bible provides us with a reconstructed version, and now we can look at the original behind the Bible by looking at Josephus. I mean, how amazing is it that we still have his writings? He was allowed to live in Rome as a free man, where he wrote down the complete history and ancient history of the Jews, and another book regarding the Jewish wars. And he had the Library of Alexandria at his disposal for this task. Therefore, he would have discussed Christ, and I think he did. Please bear in mind he was not a Christian, so do not expect a pleasant reception. Now, if we start reading his events under the reign of Tiberius, we read his supposed, alleged mention of Christ. This happens under the year AD 30. But there is a huge problem, a massive problem. It's fake. It's been added, and it's long acknowledged to have been added. He supposedly writes the following under the year 30 AD, but the problem is it's just too good to be true. Let's have a look. Now there was about this time Jesus, a wise man, if it be lawful to call him a man. For he was a doer of wonderful works, a teacher of such men as receive the truth with pleasure. He drew over to him both many of the Jews and many of the Gentiles. He was the Christ. And when Pilate, at the suggestion of the principal men among us, had condemned him to the cross, those that loved him at first did not forsake him. For he appeared to them alive again the third day, as the divine prophets had foretold these and 10,000 other wonderful things concerning him. And the tribe of Christians, so named after him, are not extinct at this day. Now, I'm actually a medieval historian, and that's my background, and to me this sounds like a medieval insertion. It doesn't sound like the rest of what Josephus writes. I think it was a margin insertion into a later manuscript, and this is what most historians think. So if you own a manuscript, you want to write things into it occasionally, as no one has any other paper, and things were written into margins all the time. A later copyist decided to insert this into the text as if Josephus had written it. Rising again on the third day is what the sun does on the solstice, so why is he talking sun religion? Well after the sun religion had combined with Christianity, presumably. So you can see quite clearly it can't possibly be an original by Josephus, who was basically a boy when Christ was a man, and a clear contemporary. You can tell, can't you, that a later Christian has written this, and Josephus was no Christian, so he would not use such glowing terms. I believe this is written in the style of someone in the Dark Ages or Middle Ages, so therefore we must discount this whole unhistorical paragraph and then move on to what he actually says under the year AD 36, which is astounding. Now, some more background. As we are going chronologically, we have Josephus to thank for this information. But to give some background, around the year 0, a man was already preaching called Judas the Galilean. This Judas founded the Zealots, the fourth sect of Judea, and therefore one of the sects of Judaism. And they believed in an immortal soul. Now, Josephus blamed these zealots for causing the wars against Rome in the first place. These were nationalists and freedom fighters mixed with religious fanatics. They thought everyone had to obey for the magic to happen and everything to come together. It was the Sicarii, the people like Judas Iscariot, the NKVD wing of the zealots, who went around assassinating people who called for peace against Rome. The reason the Romans had to eventually annihilate everyone because the Jews just wouldn't surrender, because everyone was fearing the Sicarii would come and put a knife in their back. The Sicarii had to punish people, or God would punish the whole nation. That was the view. Now, after this war of the 60s AD, the Zealots were discredited and vanished from history. It is suggested by some that St. Paul was a zealot, obviously a fanatic, who switched over to Christianity. Then we have another preacher called John the Baptist, possibly an Essene, as these people used water rituals, who Josephus thinks was commendable. And he thinks it was wrong for Herod to kill John the Baptist out of jealousy. Josephus said Herod was jealous because John's popularity and ability to preach to the masses was better than his. Note that Jesus in the Bible was considered to be John the Baptist returned, so obviously a good talker. Basically a peaceful man as well, with positive traits. Another John the Baptist. So you can see why I don't think Jesus was a Sadducee, an Essene, a Pharisee, or Zealot, because none of these really fit. But there is another one that does. The Samaritans. A sect of the Hamites related to Judaism, which claimed pedigree from Moses himself. So who better than them to be the king of the Jews? Now, firstly, some background on the Samaritans, a province between Galilee and Judea. I mean, it's in the perfect location, is it not? Every culture had a sacred world mountain which they held to be the center of the world. This is because in primordial times the world was thought of as 3 dinner plates, and the mountain was a spike through the middle which held them all together. We lived on the middle one, hence Middle Earth or Midgard. It followed that walking up the mountain brought you closer to the higher dinner plate, Asgard or Heaven, or whatever name you called it. We see this culture among the people of Commagene with their white mountain Nimrod, which looks like the Great Pyramid in its former colour. I've held that pyramids, whatever their former elaborate purpose, were surely used by Stone Ages as mountain worship to get close to Asgard. Archaeologists, haven't yet been contacted by an archaeologist 3 years after writing about those pyramids, and because I guess they're off with the fairies. But the Samaritans too had their holy mountain called Mount Gerizim, which they held as the center of creation. Every culture around the world had their own mountain, and this religion was worldwide, many millennia before Christ. And I even found out last year that Aborigines in Australia even used to erect a totem pole or even maypole on top of Uluru, as there is as the tree is also associated with World Mountain. Now, Nebuchadnezzar decided he wanted certain tribes of the Jews to live with them and took them to Babylon. They were released by Cyrus the Persian. In Babylon is where I think they combined a god, Babylonian Nergal, with Yahweh. Nergal is just like Yahweh, a god of war and also a god of plagues, which is convenient as Yahweh seems to specialize utterly in both. I think Yahweh is actually Nergal in character and another god by name. We'll get to that in another video. So when they came back to the Holy Land with their Nergal version of Yahweh, the Jews found themselves very different to the other tribes who had never been taken away, such as the Samaritans. The returned Jews built a temple in Jerusalem which was supposed to hold the Ark, if they had the original, which is unlikely. Meanwhile, the Samaritans, who had never been to Babylon, considered this sacrilegious and in turn built their own temple on Mount Gerizim, which they considered a sacred place where Moses had possibly received the laws or other holy artifacts for other reasons. This temple was later demolished, possibly by John Hyrcanus, a Jewish ruler of the 2nd century BC who was revolting against the weakened Seleucids, who were the successor state to Alexander, asserting Jewish independence. He enslaved the Samaritans and tried to convert them to Judaism because he saw that they were not Jewish, even though they were. Nevertheless, Samaritans continued to climb their mountain and worship in the ruins of their temple. After the Romans annihilated and banished the Judean Jews, the Samaritans were left over, and they began to rise to prominence, asserting their Jewish independence, and they rose to prominence significantly in the 5th and 6th centuries, and they staged their own massive revolts against the Byzantines. The Byzantines annihilated them utterly. And now there are supposedly fewer than 100 Samaritans remaining alive. That's enough of the background, because the next prophet after Judas the Galilean and John the Baptist to be mentioned by Josephus, discounting that apocryphal paragraph we discussed earlier, was, I think, the historical Christ. Of course, the word Christ wasn't perhaps invented in Josephus' time. So he called Jesus by another name. The Samaritan. Prophet. Let's get into it. These events took place in 36 AD, and you will note that the date is absolutely perfect for Jesus' age, having him die in his 30s, if he was Jesus, born around the year 0. This is what Josephus says. For a man who made light of mendacity, and in all his designs catered to the mob, rallied them, bidding them go in a body with him to Mount Gerizim, which in their belief is the most sacred of mountains. He assured them that on their arrival he would show them the sacred vessels which were buried there, where Moses had deposited them. His hearers, viewing this tale as plausible, appeared in arms. They posted themselves in a certain village named Tirathana, and as they planned to climb the mountain in a great multitude, they welcomed to their ranks the new arrivals who kept coming. But before they could ascend, Pilate blocked their projected route up the mountain with a detachment of cavalry and heavily armed infantry, who in an encounter with the first comers in the village, slew some of them in a pitched battle and put the others to flight. Many prisoners were taken, of whom Pilate put to death the principal leaders and those who were most influential among the fugitives. Now, Josephus is here claiming that Jesus had no trouble telling huge lies to the crowd. And when we look into the Gospels, Jesus does indeed say some extraordinary things, truly extraordinary, with some really huge claims. Now, the crowd in this description was armed, and we all know about St. Peter pulling out his sword and cutting off the Roman soldier's ear. The story betrays many elements, Josephus' story, in which I would say elements which are common to the Jesus story. He speaks of fugitives, the influential ones who were put to death. It says that they rounded up the fugitives, hence the opportunity for the denial of St. Peter while the cock crows story. Peter may have sought shelter in a nearby village. It says there were a great multitude of followers. Now, Josephus mentions sacred vessels which were supposedly deposited, some kind of treasure. So what vessel, I ask you, is more sacred than the ark? I believe this prophet claimed he would have showed the ark to the people, or the commandments, or something, or even something he claimed was the ark. Maybe he built a replica. By possessing these artifacts, he was therefore Moses reborn, therefore ready to take people to another holy land, a great excursion, and to become their king of the Jews. He was therefore a Messiah. Why else does Jesus of the Gospels demand that people leave their families and follow him? Follow him where? Where exactly is he supposed to take them? I mean, it just makes no sense. I mean, he must have been trying to take them elsewhere, far away. Now, if you want to know the history behind the Bible, don't use secondary sources or you will get a splitting headache. Just use primary information. It is the only way. It is the reason why the Old Testament doesn't match archaeology. The Old Testament is a secondary source approved by Nergal worshippers in Babylon in the 500s BC who cut most of it out, but then they confused everything by adding other details and stories. Now, ecce homo. Pilate put Christ on display and pointed and sneered. It's an ecce homo. It's an imperative. It's look. It's teasing and mocking. Literally, look at that man. In other words, that's your God, isn't it? Look at that man. Look at what we've done to him. It's teasing and it's nasty. The gospel story is mixed up and therefore makes no sense. They would have us believe that Pilate washed his hands, handed Jesus over to the Jews, and do what they want with him because he feared the crowd. Did he really fear any crowd? Because that's not what history says. Even after supposedly washing his hands, he then executes Jesus anyway, because he crowns him with thorns, and he writes King of the Jews on the cross and crucifies him in the Roman fashion. I mean, the gospel utterly contradicts itself and is therefore an assemblage of multiple sources. This is just Pilate's Roman cruelty in action. I mean, where is the evidence, even in the Gospels, that he handed Jesus over to the Jews? That is not discussed, because it didn't happen. They would have stoned or hanged him instead. The Gospel story contradicts itself and was written by others who were not witnesses and were never there. Now, here's the problem. This Samaritan prophet died innocent, and people would have wondered why he died, and hence the myth of, oh, well, I guess he died for our sins, because he doesn't really seem to have committed any crime. He has simply assembled people in a valley. He was taking them out for an excursion, and he was going to show them a great treasure. I mean, it seems to me that this is someone who is innocent. And what about the origin of the term Good Samaritan? I think Good Samaritan is the first word in history for Christian. Because you see, Christ means good or excellent one. Therefore, the Samaritan Christ. Good Samaritan means Samaritan Christ. I think Good Samaritan, therefore, is Christian Samaritan. And I'm really inclined in going along with the Samaritan prophet of 36 AD as the identity of the historic Christ, as it just fits the timeline best of all for his death. He was killed by Pilate, who possibly made a martyr out of him. It explains why the temple Jews were totally against Jesus, because Jesus went rounding up people from everywhere, all around the place, to proclaim himself as the new Moses and claiming to lead people to his Father's kingdom. I think Jesus and the Samaritan prophet are literally one and the same, though obviously the first one is a myth and the second one is history. This also explains, does it not, why possibly a wealthy Samaritan handed his tomb over to Jesus to be used. There was this wealthy guy who said, okay, Jesus, take my tomb. We don't know who he was, except they say he was Joseph of Arimathea. And was not Joseph of Arimathea a good Samaritan in giving Jesus his tomb? Now, Joseph of Arimathea supposedly was a trader who went to live in England, one of the first Christians. He can't have lived far from the coast. And the Crusaders actually identified Arimathea as Ramia, which is kind of the borderland between Judea and Samaria. So it's in the Samaritan direction, but it's really hard to say who he was. Now, Jesus wasn't a Judean. He wasn't a Jew in the eyes of many Judeans, but he surely found followers there, and maps indicate, if you look at a map of Jesus' travels, he went all over the place. He even went to Tyre, which was a city-state which had fallen under Roman control. He went throughout the Baal-worshipping world, even. I mean, these people were still worshipping Baal and the sun, and he preached there. Now let's read it all again in older translation, because this is so interesting. We have to repeat this, and let's go for it. So here we go. But the nation of the Samaritans did not escape without tumults. The man who excited them to it was one who thought lying a thing of little consequence, and who contrived everything so that the multitude might be pleased. So he bid them get together on Mount Gerizim, which is by them looked upon as the most holy of all mountains, and assured them that when they were come thither, he would show them those sacred vessels which were laid under that place, because Moses put them there. So presumably they were going to excavate that temple. So they came thither armed, and thought the discourse of the man probable. And as they abode at a certain village, which was called Tirathaba, they got the rest together to them, and desired to go up the mountain in a great multitude together. But Pilate prevented their going up, by seizing upon the roads with a great band of horsemen and footmen, who fell upon those that were gotten together in the village. And when it came to an action, some of them they slew, and others they put to flight, and took a great many alive. The principal of which, and also the most potent of those that fled away, Pilate ordered to be slain. But when this tumult was appeased, the Samaritan Senate sent an embassy to Vitellius, a man who had been consul and was now president of Syria, and accused Pilate of the murder of those who were killed. For that they did not go to Tirathaba in order to revolt from the Romans, but to escape the violence of Pilate. So Vitellius sent Marcellus, a friend of his, to take care of the affairs of Judea, and ordered Pilate to go to Rome to answer before the emperor to the accusation of the Jews. So Pilate, when he had tarried 10 years in Judea, made haste to Rome, and this in obedience to the orders of Vitellius, which he durst not contradict. But before he could get to Rome, Tiberius was dead. And that entry is dated AD 37, March the 16th. That's when it happened. So suddenly we have just read the tradition of Pilate killing an innocent man. We know exactly when it happened. We know when Tiberius decided to prosecute the guy and ordered him to Rome. for slaying innocent people, possibly for his own greed, his own treasure hunting. I mean, is this a coincidence? The years are almost perfect if we want to fit the historical Jesus. And isn't that what the Gospels are all about? Pilate killing an innocent man. That's what they're all about. The Samaritans complained that no crime had been committed to justify what occurred. This is the same as the Gospel story. The rebellion against Rome that wasn't really. I mean, isn't it the same thing? The Jesus story is of a rebellion against Rome that wasn't. Yet it is treated as a rebellion by the Romans, and then an indecisive Pilate didn't know what to do with his captives. History explains why. He himself was totally at fault and knew he was probably in the wrong, so he wasn't sure whether to execute the guy or not. So Pilate obviously wanted whatever treasure was there for himself. We will never know what it was. What was Pontius Pilate like? Well, we have the witnesses from the actual time. Philo tells us that he had a vindictiveness and furious temper, and he was naturally inflexible, a blend of self-will and relentlessness. It says, his corruption and his acts of insolence and his rapine and his habit of insulting people, hey, that's like ecce homo, insulting people, and his cruelty, and his continual murders of people, untried and uncondemned, and his never-ending and gratuitous and most grievous inhumanity. Now, that's from an eyewitness, Philo. So I would say to you, that sounds rather different to the Pilate of the Gospels, which tells us that the Gospels are based on a Romanized tradition, which wanted to be sympathetic to the Romans, put the blame on the Jews. I find it ridiculous that Josephus, as a historian, would actually omit the Samaritan prophet's name. I don't think he did. And it must have been removed during transcription, as we don't have Josephus' original writings. They're all copies of copies of copies of copies. So what was it? Was his name Jesus? Can you see how inconvenient that would be if they left that in there? So let's read a bit about Samaria in the time of Jesus, a beautiful country. This is what Josephus says. He says, now as to the country of Samaria, it lies between Judea and Galilee. It begins at a village that is in the great plain called Guinea and ends in the Acrabene Toparchy, and is entirely of the same nature with Judea, with both countries made of hills and valleys, which are moist enough for agriculture, very fruitful. They have an abundance of trees. They are full of autumnal fruit, both of which grows wild, and that which is the effect of cultivation. They are naturally watered by many rivers, but derive their chief moisture from rainwater, of which they have no want. For those rivers which they have, all their waters are exceedingly sweet. By reason also of the excellent grass they have, their cattle yield more milk than do those in other places. And what is the greatest sign of excellency and of abundance? They, each of them, are very full of people. In the limits of Samaria and Judea lies the village of Anuaf, which is also called Boreas. That is the northern boundary of Judea. Now, the Samaritans clearly saw themselves as of the same tradition of Moses. It explains why Jesus led his followers into a wilderness with little food, recreating Moses, I guess also escaping Pilate, to show his followers that he was a new Moses. It explains the 40 days in the desert, which Jesus did, which is just being on the mountain like Moses, talking to a god. It was actually a reenactment of the Ten Commandments, or it was again, it was conveniently being away from the cities, escaping from Pilate. That's the reason he went into the wilderness, but that is not made clear in the Gospels. Now, unlike the Judeans, the Samaritans would have had religions closer to the Phoenicians, since the Samaritans in many ways expressed an earlier form of their Canaanite religion. Hence, it was easy to spread Christianity to all the former Hamite areas, including the UK. With which they still traded. There would have been Hamitic Phoenician cities in the UK. Plenty of Brits had very dark features, even until recent times. Christianity was never a religion of Judea, but Christianity is itself seemingly based on Moses, mixed with Samaritan ideas, possibly. When Elagabalus brought his holy rock to Rome, representing World Mountain, centre of the world, he was expressing ideas related to Christianity, but also a far earlier religion. Now, the Samaritans, since they had a temple on top of Mount Gerizim, even modern Samaritans still actually go up there to pray in the ruins, and this is probably exactly what this guy was going to do. But he actually stated he was going to excavate and dig up Moses' artifacts. So that's when Pilate decided enough was enough, and he was going to stop this, and he was going to kill off all the leaders. Why? Probably to take the treasure. I don't see any other reason. And to end this rebellion forever, these people moving around, trying to escape from him, his cruelty. Now, here's the proof. Because you will notice in the New Testament that Jesus gave a Sermon on the Mount, approximately a 7-minute speech. Now, why would you march people up a mountain somewhere and talk to them for a few minutes? Does that make only a few minutes? Does that make any sense at all to you? I bet he talked for hours. And the mountain is not named in the gospel. If the gospel is written by witnesses, where's the name? Where's the geography? There isn't any. Do you know why? Firstly, it was too inconvenient to mention. And later, the people who wrote it down didn't have a clue. But it was so inconvenient to write down because it would have been Mount Gerizim. It was really the main one that the Jews worshipped at, or the non-Judea Jews, thus revealing Christ as a Samaritan or mountain worshipper, his true identity. Well, it's basically in the Gospels, isn't it? And then we have more evidence, the parable of the Good Samaritan. Jesus says that a man beat up by robbers was ignored by a temple priest of Judea who just walked past and looked away, as did another guy, another priest, a Levite. But the Good Samaritan, or I suppose he means Christ Samaritan, Christian, looked after the man. Why would Jesus... just read it in Greek. It says, Good Samaritan is Christ Samaritan. Why would Jesus glorify the Samaritans at the expense of the other Jews? To conclude, we have a man, a Samaritan, mentioned in history, lived at the right time, died at the right age, killed by Pilate, a friend of Samaritans, but also seeking to unite with other Jewish sects to grow his movement, that is, sects of the province of Roman Palestine, but in sympathy with them rather than sectarian. This Samaritan prophet made very grand statements which he used to attract followers, which is consistent with Jesus of the Bible. But that is why Jesus is so hard to place. Jesus of the Gospels goes up the mountains. There is a transfiguration even, which I suppose is worship of the rising sun and moon. The Gospel authors do not know or care to name the mountain, which is surely Mount Gerizim. Dangerous information. Why would Jesus have gone up the mountain if he wasn't a Samaritan? The Romans or the Jews or the Christians have changed the story. Jewish means of Judea, and possibly this prophet wished to convert Jews to his more Canaanite ideas, starting his own nation. Now, I wish that was the end of the story so I could get on to other subjects, but it's not. It's not, because there's more information coming up. The Samaritan prophet is probably Jesus, but what we understand about Jesus and what the Romans understood about Jesus is another matter entirely. Now, you can't be born in two places at once, Bethlehem and Nazareth. Proof enough that more than one historical person is mythical Jesus. So, there were more of them. There were imitators, and these contaminated later ideas. Ideas involving river baptisms and uprisings in Jerusalem. We will move on to these in subsequent videos. Thank you. These imitators were able to blend into the Jesus story because they all happened within about 30 years of each other, being written down about 2 generations later, probably by Christians, into the Gospels, by people who were never in the Holy Land, to sell for Greco-Roman consumption. I think Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are actually the names of book publishers and not even authors. I'll see you in the next video. Cheers.